Premier, Minister, Director General, and Alec, thank you very much indeed for that extraordinarily warm welcome, and thank you for allowing me to be here at this particular moment in Perth, and with my colleagues to present some of the collections of the museum with the objects from the Western Australian Museum in the context of the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting. I want to talk this evening about museums and the global world, and what the connection is between the global world and museums. And in fact, the two are exactly the same age. The museum as we know it is a creation of the 18th century, and the need to have museums, to have citizens who understand the world, is something that became part of the political understanding of society in Europe in the 18th century. I want to begin, if I may, very much with the British Museum, because in a strange way that is where the story starts. It's the first national museum in the world. It's the first public museum set up in the way that we understand it, a museum with trustees, where the collection is held for the public, not controlled by the government, and set up as a direct result of the first global moment in the world economy. Mid-18th century London is the first city that traded with the whole world. British shipping was so extensive that it was possible for the first time to gather into one place objects from all over the world. And it became clear to Parliament that as London and the UK was trading with the whole world, it was necessary to understand it, and that the citizen must be enabled to make sense of the world. And so an extraordinary idea was born that Parliament would buy a collection that would represent the achievements of human societies from the whole world, from the beginning to the present day, and put the world under one roof. It was the result of the first moment of global trade in the mid-18th century, and it remained a uniquely global collection, aiming not to present great works of art, although it holds great works of art, but to present the story of how different societies organize themselves. And from the beginning, it was to be open free to every citizen, and not just citizens, free to the whole world, which I'll come back to later on, because that's why we're so pleased to have this partnership with the Western Australian Museum in Perth to make a reality of that ideal of 250 years ago. What the museum now is the buildings, the famous neoclassical exterior of the 1820s. In the year 2000, it opened the Great Court with the roof by Norman Foster, creating a great internal space, a great public arena, which has profoundly changed the way that the public can use the museum. And I'll come back later on to what I think that now means for museums in a global world. And at the heart of the museum, from the beginning, was the notion of research. This was to be a place where things were collected, things were studied, and the public were to be enabled to understand by the scholars who had researched the things. So in the middle of the British Museum, in this space you see there, is the famous reading room of the British Library. Until the library moved 15 years ago to a separate building. The space, you know what librarians are like for books, and it became impossible to house the two together. But it remains, in a sense, the heart of the museum. These three elements are what the museum is about. It's sort of the collection, the research, and the public engagement with it. This was where the purpose of the museum was intellectually achieved. Parliament had wanted the citizen to be able to inform themselves about the world, to make sense of the world, to find ways of articulating what it is that holds us all together. And if the 18th century was the century where global trade began, and where Parliament created this world under one roof, by the middle of the 19th century, there was a global economy, world under one system, the system of capitalism and colonialism. And it's here, of course, that one person really made sense of that system then, got his own view of the world, because it's in this room that Karl Marx wrote Das Kapital. This is the application for Karl Marx's reader's ticket, as you see here, certifying that he's over 21. We have two applications from Lenin, one under a false name, one under his own name. But it is, in this space, it is the museum in fulfilling its collection, allowing people to think about the world and to come to their own conclusions about it. And in the 20th century, after global trade and a global economic system, we have, I think, something quite different as we approach the new century. We have global populations. The extraordinary movements of peoples in the last 40, 50 years, the migrations from all over the world in all directions, tourism, people traveling for business. We now have, in most cities, populations that are by no means local, and in some cases are entirely global. The extraordinary fact in London of having a population which speaks 300 mother tongues, and where 2/3 of the people now living in central London were born outside the UK. This is a phenomenon that the world has not known before, and it's replicated across the world. And it gives, I think, museums a new role. It is ever more important for the citizen, who is de facto a citizen of the world, to be able to make sense of the world. And that is what museums are for, everywhere. I think to allow the citizen to make sense of the world in which they now live. That's what lies behind the origins of the museum and our desire to share the collections with the rest of the world, to travel the collection, and to use the collection to explore some of these key elements of our shared histories, without which it's going to be harder to understand the world now. And that's why we were so pleased when Alec Coles asked if we could put together an exhibition of stories from the Commonwealth through objects in the museum. And in the extraordinary short space of 4 or 5 months, the colleagues in the two institutions have managed to do that. I want to start as an object with one of the objects in the exhibition. It is, as you can see, a statue of the Hindu god Ganesh. It's made in Orissa, in northeast India, somewhere around 1200. And he's a good place to start because Ganesh is, as you know, the god who overcomes impossible obstacles. And preparing the exhibition, it certainly seemed that at moments only Ganesh would be able to pull it off. But he's also shown here, interestingly, with his 4 hands. But in this hand, I hope you can see, he's holding one of his broken off tusks. This is the complete one, this is the broken off one, because Ganesh makes all kinds of sacrifices in order to achieve his aims. And I suspect the Premier at moments in the last couple of weeks, as Chogham has got into gear, feels slightly as though he's holding a tusk in one hand. It's a good place to start, though, because it is an object that is in the British Museum because of the desire to explain one culture to another. It was acquired around 1810 in Calcutta by a remarkable British trader operating in Calcutta, known as Hindu Stewart. Stewart became more and more concerned that the British did not understand and did not respect Hindu culture, that they didn't see that this was a great moral system, a great set of ethical values articulated through an imagery that Europeans could not read. He tried to do all kinds of things to persuade them of the superiority of Hindu culture, particularly tried to persuade the Memsahibs to abandon corsets and wear saris, which they resisted. But he decided that he would form a collection of sculpture to present to Europeans in Calcutta to explain the values of Hinduism. And it's one of the first we know of a European deliberately setting out to undermine the supremacies of European culture by presenting the works of another, as he's always going to be completely necessary if the two communities were going to live together. It was in Stewart's museum in Calcutta, and then it came to the British Museum. What Stuart could never have known was that so would very large numbers of people from Calcutta, and that a huge Bengali population would one day come to see his statues in London, not as a way of presenting an alien culture, but a way of reconnecting with their own. And one of the very touching things of this statue is that we frequently find offerings of flowers and sometimes milk in front of it from London Hindus, London Bengalis, using it in a way that Stuart could never have predicted, but which is, I think, the purpose of the museums in many ways. That population is now enormous. There's a very substantial Bengali population from East and West Bengal living in London. And one of the roles of the museum is, of course, to let the new British population recover and remain in contact with their own traditions, while setting those traditions in the context of the world. And 2 years ago, we decided we would focus on Bengal, and to focus on one of the great festivals of Bengal, the Durga Puja, the festival of the goddess Durga. This is a large paper statue. The goddess Durga is revered in an autumn festival when she comes from the Himalayas. She is in the lower waters of Bengal, and she returns to her parents. It's a myth of cyclical renewal, seasonal return, the snows melting, the rains, and then the season starting again. And it also has all the usual narratives you'd expect of good triumphing over evil, all of which you'll be able to work out going on here. The Durga Puja festival in Calcutta is one of the great, great moments of the city. And it is, of course, a Hindu festival, but it's one in which all the population joins in, Muslim as well. And in a very real sense, it's a Bengali festival rather than just a Hindu one. We asked craftsmen from West Bengal to come to build in the Great Court a statue of Durga. Essential part of the festival is the making of a statue of Durga in that iconography that you saw before. And it has to be made using some earth from Bengal. Various elements have got to be in the statue. And it's made temporary statue for the festival. It was made in the Great Court over a period of weeks. Tens of thousands of Bengalis came to watch the process as it was being made. Grandparents bringing their grandchildren who had never seen it in Bengal to discover it in London. And fascinatingly, both Muslim and Hindu Bengalis came. We know that from the visitors' books and the comments. A pan-Bengali engagement. And around that, we were able to organize events for the Bengali population. This is a demonstration of the way in which that space is a public forum where enormous events can happen. We can hold 3,000 or 4,000 people comfortably in that space at any one time. And over the period, very large numbers came. It was a moment where Bengalis could present their culture to indigenous British friends, could recover it for themselves, and where it could be discussed in public. And where we could also present from the rest of the collection, in the context of the festival, demonstration of the long tradition of religious tolerance in Bengal. This is a mid-18th century scroll from Bengal showing on the left a Hindu performing puja, and on the right a Muslim preparing to pray. And it had particularly impressed 18th century British traders and administrators that the two societies lived so peacefully together. And, of course, that's a point we wanted to insist on, given the very critical and dangerous debates that are currently taking place in India about relationship between the religions and the secular traditions of India, and how these two traditions can coexist. What it led to was, I think, a far deeper understanding of what it means to be Bengali, the links culturally that go beyond the religious divide, and also the extent to which Bengali Britons had become totally British while remaining Bengali. One of the great characteristics of all religions, of course, is the power to transform reality by particular actions at particular moments. At the end of Durga Puja, the statue, which is a temporary statue, has to be committed to the waters of the Ganges so that Durga can return to her family. But by one of those great religious transformations, any river can be, for the purposes of the moment, classified as the Ganges. So at the end of the festival, Durga was dismantled. And here you see her being returned to the Ganges at Pottery Bridge, which is the perfect emblem, mercifully or happily, a rainbow. I hope you can just see the rainbow came out at just the moment when the London Ganges received Durga, as a perfect emblem, I think, of what this kind of cultural investigation can do, and how the museum can play a unique role, I think. It would have been impossible for a Hindu temple to have the same kind of non-Hindu engagement. The very few public spaces which, like the museum, belong to everybody, can be used by everybody for this kind of activity. That's one thing that I think is important in the global world, the museum's role. If you like, it's the feel-good effect that the museum can offer on a societal scale. But it's also important, I think, to focus on the disturbing issues as well. And one of the objects in the exhibition in Perth is this throne of weapons from Mozambique, which joined the Commonwealth fairly recently. And it's made, as you can see, entirely of decommissioned weapons. Mozambique had, as you know, brutal civil war after independence, in which well over 1 million were killed and several million maimed. And when it came to an end, the weapons continued to circulate. The Anglican bishop of southern Mozambique, Denis Singolani, decided that it was critical to get these weapons out of circulation, or violence would continue. He started a scheme called Swords into Plowshares, where if villagers surrendered their weapons, they were given tractors or bicycles or sewing machines to earn the money that they had stopped being able to earn during the Civil War. And then, eager to show that the weapons were really dead to their original purpose, commissioned an artist, Kester, to make public sculpture out of them. And this is one of these public sculptures. The museum was very keen to explore the question and to document through its collections the tragedy of the post-colonial, post-independence civil wars. And when we were preparing our first exhibition of this, we asked Kofi Annan to talk about why it was that so many African countries after independence had this experience of civil war. I hadn't thought in this way before, he very lucidly pointed out that the people who, of course, had won independence were usually the people who had fought against independence, were military leaders who were far more used to the skills of fighting than to the compromises of government. And that was one of the elements, along with the foreign interests that then competed for the new country. The throne makes a very alarming point if you treat it curatorially. If you do the standard thing of asking where the different bits come from, you realize that, to go back, this is Russian, this is Czech, this is Polish, this is North Korean. You realize very quickly that this is a civil war in Africa fought entirely by weapons made outside, that African civil wars are possible only because of international arms trades. This happened to come from an area that was being funded and supported by the Soviets. From a different part of Mozambique, you would have found weapons made in Britain, France, and Germany. A very disturbing point, and a critical one, if we're talking about the global realities now and the connections between Europe and Africa now. But it had such a response from our public, this object, that we decided that it was important that it should be seen outside the museum. And so we sent it on a whole series of exhibitions around the United Kingdom, but not to museums. We sent it to schools, and a whole series of school projects were run on the violence as play and toy weapons and so on. But we also sent it to places like shopping centres, where around the object we organised public debates, so that in one East London community centre there was a discussion among victims of gun crime, where gun crime was particularly strong. It went to Pentonville Prison and was part of a project for prisoners serving sentences for gun crime. It went to Coventry Cathedral for the 11th of November Remembrance Day armistice service as a demonstration of reconciliation achieved in Africa in the context of Coventry Cathedral, which had been dedicated to Anglo-German reconciliation. And perhaps most interesting of all, it went to Belfast on Good Friday, because, as you know, one of the great failures in Northern Ireland was ever to achieve agreement on the displaying of the decommissioned weapons and showing that they were now beyond use. And the presence of this object in Northern Ireland on Good Friday was a very powerful focus for reflection on why what had been possible in Mozambique was not possible in Ireland, and what lessons might be drawn from that. It's one of the remarkable things, I think, about objects, that they can be part of so many stories, both historical and contemporary, of a particular place and of communities not at all connected with the place of origin. And it's also, I think, important that it shows how much objects can work outside the museum context. They can travel, many of them, into spaces where they're not normally expected and where they can galvanize debate. These have been very particular examples of global connections. But the point of the museum in the 18th century, this is the Enlightenment gallery of the British Museum, was, of course, to insist that all these issues are for all humanity. That 18th century belief that we are all alike, all trying to do the same things, if in slightly different ways. And it's in this context that the things that the museum has collected can and still do disturb our assumptions and demonstrate the communality of our inheritance. In the exhibition in Perth is this object, the oldest object in the British Museum, a chopping tool made in Tanzania somewhere around 1.8, 2 million years ago. One of the first things made by people like us, not actually Homo sapiens, but people like us. And it's a tool that's been chipped to produce a cutting edge here, a very good cutting edge that strips meat off bone and breaks the bone and lets you get the marrow. And it's this kind of tool that really made human existence possible by giving us access to that protein. What is fascinating in the three axes, the three tools from the Old Juvai Gorge in Tanzania that are here now in Perth, is how they show the one common quality of all humanity. This is what we first make. Very shortly after, we make this. Totally symmetrical, which has no real advantage at all as a practical tool, but beautifully shaped, and made of a wonderful sparkling glistery quartz. This is, we think, the oldest documented evidence for bling in human history. And it shows that we are hardwired to bling. We like flashy things, and we like symmetrical things. But it also shows, of course, something remarkable. Whereas you can just about imagine how you get to this by chipping away without thinking very far ahead, you can't make this out of a bit of rock without having the idea of where you're going to finish in your head before you start. You need a conceptual understanding of a shape which you will release from the stone around it. You need some kind of abstract capacity to make this object, and then you make it beautiful. And we recently discovered that the part of the brain that allows you skillfully to shape and to chip a stone is the same part of the brain that deals with language. To shape a stone is to be able to shape a sentence. And the making of this, on which we all depend, is clearly somehow connected with language. Beside these early tools and early bling, we've been able to put this extraordinary object from the Perth Museum's own collection, the oldest surviving known necklace, human decoration, human ornament, 30,000 years old from Exmouth, demonstrating that, again, the deep need to adorn ourselves, to make things beautiful as well as functional. And even more than that, looking at in the same tradition as this, quest for beauty, also a further point, the third tool on exhibition, when you see it, is about that high. You couldn't possibly use it as a tool. It's been made for some other purpose, presumably to show status. This is presumably an outsize chopping tool, hand axe, that is held by the king or the priest or is offered to the gods. We don't know. But all this is over 1 million years old. And it demonstrates that the need we have to control our environment by making tools, which is what makes us different from animals, to make things beautiful and to use them in a context of power or faith is absolutely central to the human experience. We start by making things for use, and then we use them for other purposes. And we wanted to stay in Africa to end this particular narrative with an object that is, I suppose you could, an emblem of the oneness of humanity. The one that united the whole world a few years ago was the Football World Cup in South Africa. And the one thing that infuriated the whole world was the vuvuzela. This is also in the exhibition. And I don't know whether people were more united by their enthusiasm for the game or their dislike for the noise this produced. But fascinatingly, we wanted, of course, to document this object. Very quickly, in fact, during the same season, people in South Africa were producing ornaments in the shape of vuvuzela. The instrument becomes an ornament, always. It's one of the givens of human experience. And all these objects are in the exhibition. The opportunities that this kind of looking at things gives are remarkable because it does, of course, let us discover stories that aren't written. This is obviously prehistory, not the vuvuzelas, the earlier ones. But in other areas, it's the things that tell us, even well into the written period, tell us about human behavior. And one of the most interesting elements in the British Museum's collection came in the late 1940s, when a beachcomber in Tanzania on the island of Kilwa came across a rubbish dump on which people had thrown away old crockery. And he found this astonishing assortment of crockery, probably about 1,000 years old. And he got interested in the different bits. And to cut a long story short, what you have here in this selection of fragments of broken pots is an extraordinary history of the trade of the Indian Ocean, because this kind of this green celadon porcelain is Chinese export porcelain, probably 11th century, made for export to the Middle East and to Africa, and used there. This is probably from Iran, and decorated with material and with a style found only in Iran. This is probably from Syria, and this is indigenous East African pottery. What you have in this is demonstration that Kilwa, around 1,000 years ago, was the great trading center where the ivory and the gold from Africa was exported, and the porcelain of the Eastern Indian Ocean and the Gulf came to East Africa, where it was used with the local pottery. It's evidence of the fact that the Indian Ocean has, from time immemorial, been a circle of exchange where trade goods, peoples, ideas, religions have circulated. And part of that story is, of course, the shipwrecks on the west coast of Australia. And I wanted to show this because one of the things we want to focus on with our colleagues in the Western Australian Museum is precisely working on this history of the Indian Ocean, which can be written only partly through the texts of the later period and very largely through the things. A narrative that's becoming increasingly important as the Indian Ocean resumes its central position as a great economic exchange area, as it was in 1100, and which, of course, modern Perth is now playing an enormously important role in the exchange of goods. I want to look at a couple of things now that show the power of objects to overturn stories. These show the power of objects to tell stories, and I've done that with some of the other objects. But perhaps even more valuable is what objects can do to overturn the story we already know. And around 1900, the story that every white person knew was that European civilization was superior and African civilization was savage. The objects produced by Africans showed they were emotional, irrational, out of control. They were about people at a lower level of development than us. That was the given. That's the basis on which the whole colonial enterprise worked. So it came as a great shock when this object was excavated in modern Nigeria, Ife, somewhere around 1910, because this is clearly not the kind of African art that we expect. This is not the kind of mask that so excited Clay and Picasso. This is a beautifully observed portrait turned into a symmetrically shaped image of power. It's an image of a king of Ife, made around 1300, wearing a ceremonial crown of beads made in beautifully cast bronze using the lost wax method with space for the moustache and beard hair here. It completely bewildered Europeans, except the Germans. Professor Frobenius in Berlin realized at once that this was so beautiful it couldn't possibly be made by an African. It must be made by a Greek. And he then went on, warming to his theme, to remember the story of Atlantis, the lost continent in the Atlantic inhabited by Greeks that sank. And this was the demonstration that it had sunk off the coast of Nigeria, and the Greeks had stepped deftly ashore and produced this. It was scientific evidence, the scientific examination, largely in the British Museum, that demonstrated this was a totally indigenous African production. An object that made all the assumptions of colonial superiority untenable. And I was very thrilled, I think all our colleagues in the British Museum were very thrilled that this was chosen as the poster image for the extraordinary objects, because it is an object that is in the fullest sense extraordinary, not just in its own quality, but in what it did to change the way we've been able to think about the relationship between African and European cultures. This is exactly contemporary with the early Renaissance in Italy, but nobody ever teaches us, at least didn't teach me at university, that Africa had a Renaissance at the same time as Florence. It is an object that, in its way, changed the world. And it's these disturbing stories that are perhaps the most valuable. This is in the exhibition, so is this. And this is another object that tells very uncomfortable truths and unsettles the things we thought we knew. It was bought in 1730 by Hans Sloane, the man whose collection is at the heart of the British Museum, who was part of that great movement to gather things from all over the world, to compare peoples. He was interested in how different peoples had musical instruments. Every culture has music. They all do it in a different way. And he bought this in Virginia, and when the museum opened in 1759, this was on show as a drum made by American Indians. Around 1900, a British Museum curator thought it looked rather more African than American, but couldn't be very certain. Then the botanists got on the case and established that this is made of a cordia tree, a tree that's found only in West Africa, and and that these straps are also made from plants that grow only in West Africa. And indeed, it became clear that from the style of the drum that this is a drum that's part of a chief's orchestra in West Africa. How did it get to Virginia? Well, it can only have been in the context of the slave trade. And we know that drums were carried on the ships to make the slaves dance so that they didn't become too unfit because of lack of exercise or too depressed and try to kill themselves, which they often did. So you're looking at a musical instrument with a very particular dark purpose. But it's also darker than that, because no slave, of course, was able to take anything with them. This can't have been taken by a slave. This is a chief's drum. And we know, of course, that the slave trade operated by the Europeans, largely by the British, depended on the African chiefs taking slaves and selling them. And this is almost certainly given by the African chief to the captain, so that the cargo would arrive in good condition. A very unpleasant twist to the story of the complicity in the slave trade of the African rulers. And another twist later on, when this hide was examined and discovered to be almost certainly North American, and prepared, as you would expect, North American Indians to prepare it. And it is, of course, a known fact that American Indians themselves had black slaves. So another fact that is uncomfortable for all kinds of reasons in contemporary politics and the assumptions that are often made and on which much argument rests. It is also, of course, the oldest documented Afro-American musical instrument. And it's from this that the whole tradition of jazz, reggae, blues, all comes from this drumming tradition. And when we showed it specifically to mark the 200th anniversary of the abolition of the slave trade in 2007, very large numbers came to the museum to hear talks about this and to rethink the apparently simple narratives of the slave trade in a way that is less comfortable for us all, but important, I think, to grasp. And it's been wonderful in the exhibition to have it in Perth beside this extraordinary object from the collection of the Western Australian Museum. A sampler, you probably won't be able to read it, with a religious verse, a poem here, embroidered by Fanny Tatlock, liberated African, Sierra Leone, 1824. And she, probably liberated by the British Navy, stopping illegal slave trades, possibly adopted by the Tatlock family in Britain, who supported Sierra Leone, the country in Africa that would be free from slavery. And Fanny Tatlock married a missionary, and emigrated to Western Australia. And these two objects together give such an extraordinary narrative of the forced movement of peoples, the chosen movement of peoples, and the complexities of the Commonwealth, of which we're all inheritors. It's these kind of links and questions that I think make the objects and the museum today so valuable and so powerful. They raise all kinds of questions. Very briefly, this from Pakistan is one of the oldest known representations of the Buddha, around 300, for reasons nobody understands. suddenly Buddhism, which has already been established for centuries, moves from using symbols to represent Buddha to representing him as a human being, as a person. And this is one of the earliest known. This beautiful statue, which we all now immediately recognize as Buddha, created around 300 and becomes fixed as the iconography forever. At exactly the same moment as Christian iconography starts representing Jesus as a human being. Previously, it's been a cross or a fish. And why, at the same time, we don't know. But the power of this, then, to spread across South Asia as the image of Buddha is indisputable. And just for one wonderful juxtaposition from the two collections, you have in your collection this dress of Queen Victoria from the 1880s. I have to say, she looks at her best front on. Side on, it's pretty alarming. The height-width ratio is, I think, for most of us, pretty distressing. But it's what she was wearing, it's now in your collection, it's what she was wearing in 1887, the Golden Jubilee, the 50 years. And in the same year, from the official portrait, a Nigerian carver, a Yoruba carver, made his rendering of Queen Victoria. And here she is. Queen Victoria as a Yoruba chieftain. You can see the features have been made to be properly beautiful in a Yoruba sense. She's been slimmed down very encouragingly. And she's been given a fan, which is much more like a Yoruba fly whisk, and a symbol of authority. All people looking at the same thing in different ways. What does this mean? It means that I think our museums are a unique opportunity to show the world and to think of the world as other people see it, and the totality of the world. And this summer at the British Museum, the world we wanted to show was Australia. Now, as you know, our cultural life in England is completely run by Australians. And we're putty in the hands of our new masters. And in botanical terms, of course, Steve Hopper has been running Kew for several years, and the British Museum and Kew have been working together. We can't, unlike the Western Australian Museum, we no longer have the geology and the natural history. That was separated over a century ago. Luckily, you still have it together in one house. But we wanted to show the connection between landscape, Aboriginal culture, and modern Australia. So Steve bravely said he would recreate this landscape in the forecourt of the British Museum. Well, that's the real thing. This is us. We tried. But in the middle of Australia, the whole of Australia is encompassed in this one garden, with in the middle a suitably red desert, as you see here, which you can cross going from one to the other, and showing the flora and the different vegetation. At the same time, we had an exhibition of Aboriginal baskets as a way of demonstrating the extraordinary capacity of the Aboriginal communities to dominate the environment and use it. So an object like this kelp basket, water carrier, from Tasmania, collected in the 1820s and shown fascinatingly at the 1851 Great Exhibition of the Manufactures of All Nations. And it is, of course, one of the extraordinary things about the museum's collection that it has these old versions. And we were able to show contemporary, beautiful baskets of this sort, showing Aboriginal basket work as sculpture. Steve Hopper telling us, of course, what the various plants were. And again, a project we want to develop with the Western Australian Museum. At the same time, we had responses to the landscape in contemporary prints and drawings. We've been building up steadily to what is now, I think, without question, the best collection of 20th century prints and drawings from Australia, outside Australia, with works like the Nolan here, shown beside the Rover Thomas. And exploring what it is that people know about Australia now, what defines it. And of course, this is part of the story that has to be there. Everybody outside Australia knows Ned Kelly is part of the story and is part of the image. And then we couldn't resist including this wonderful thing. It's dishes in a rack called, I hope you can see, an opera house in every home. And it is really where I want to finish, because it does, I think, very much make the point that museums can explore these different areas at so many different levels. They can allow the world to explore the world and to understand the world in a way that we need dramatically now. And we hope very much that the partnership between the two museums is going to enable us to work closely over the next 5 years in pursuing some of these questions through research programs, through exhibitions, through public events, so that the original idea of the museum in the 18th century as a place where the world could examine itself can be advanced together with the British Museum and the Western Australian Museum. And I'm very grateful to you all, as are my colleagues at the British Museum, for making that possible. Thank you very much.